All right. I'd say the most British thing about me is I really enjoy black tea with cream and sugar.
Well, this is where I'm gonna tell you that's not very British.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I think as like a kid, I grew up drinking it, and it was like my family and I LARPing as like having a British thing, like, tea in the afternoon or something. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
no,
That's just,
no, tea with sugar definitely, but
yeah.
I've never really understood what Americans mean by cream because we
Oh,
we definitely exclusively use milk. Like
I like cream. I don't know. I guess it's maybe just like the thickness of it. Um,
I've tried to watch Stalker twice now.
yeah, it's a hard one to get through.
I think the first time it was pretty late at night and I got
Mm-hmm.
like an hour into it and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna need like more sleep and a notepad to remember this. And the
Mm-hmm.
second time, I don't know if I was just in a bad mood, but I got about half an hour extra into it while making notes. But I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely one for a slow burn, whether it's music or films or whatever. That's
Right.
never been a problem with me.
Mm-hmm.
But I just can't get into it.
Yeah, it took me a while to get into him. And then once I was like, I feel like I'd crossed the threshold. He's kind of like Dostoevsky, like it's not like enjoyable to read,
Mm.
but like it's important to read, and you're
Okay.
like, I'm glad I did that. And it's like, I gained a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I,
mean, Stalker to me, I've seen it like 3 times now. And to me, I feel like
I've
that's
almost
like,
caught up with you.
what's up?
I've almost caught up with you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's to me, philosophically, it's one of the best pieces of cinema addressing faith, or yeah, kind of like, you have the stalker who is he's not even a zealot. I wouldn't really, I think that'd be too degrading to call him a zealot, but he's mystical and he believes in ritual, and it's not linear, like the approach that they take through the zone, which is very similar to orthodoxy and just religion in general. Is it's not some sort of rational utility. It's like there's a certain level of like attention, and attention is like dismantling everything around you to operate in it. So it's like, and then you have him with the two men who want to get like their wishes granted. You have the artist writer, and that is the self-serving career worship. Bataille has said that the fallacy of the artist is that they worship their careers, and I would agree with that. Um, Something I struggle with. And then you have the scientist, who's kind of needs to prove everything empirically, and then kind of he approaches things from a more liberal standpoint of should this exist in the world, or shouldn't this exist in the world? This is a threat to stability, or the party or something. And I kind of there's something to the stalker where he's kind of like an idiot savant, God's fool, and that's kind of what faith puts you in. Is it puts you in this position of uh, disrespect in a lot of ways. And I think that's kind of an interesting position to be in, where Bong Chu Han, the I guess he's South Korean born, but he's been in Germany for a long time. Philosopher, he's kind of his answer to a lot of our systematized, Enlightenment inherited society is, idiotism, like the idea of choosing stupidity, or, like kind of how there's a certain amount of like sacredness to the fool,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's kind of what the stalker represents. He's kind of naive in a lot of ways and innocent, and he's caused like his family great issues, like his daughter is like mutated, perhaps from radiation in the zone. his wife resents him and stuff, but he still feels like this, he feels compelled to do something, which I think as an artist, I think that you can definitely feel that, like a kind of spiritual compulsion to do something. So, I mean, I kind of feel like we're getting into it now, so we can kind of.
I think Stalker specifically, I need to give it another crack. I need to make sure, I need to like do a Clockwork Orange and like tie myself down and make sure I get through all of it.
Yeah,
I don't know. That would be an interesting conversation as well. Like if I'm if it's not clicking with me, because it clearly resonates with you in a way you can describe, like in a way I can understand. I'm already thinking to myself how I've misunderstood it and I should go back and watch it. So I think that'd be a good conversation to have once I actually get through it.
Sure. I'd love to. Yeah. I would say like, I don't know what your drink of choice is, but just like, set aside some time, maybe have your notebook, but also just, have a drink, and just kind of Tarkovsky. It's like, it's not linear. I mean, he's not really a symbolist, and he's not really like a dramatist. He's more of a poet, and he's more of an experiential person. It's like you kind of get absorbed into the atmosphere of his films more. They're exhaustingly long. He's like one of my favorite directors, but I never watch him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think most of the notes I did take were about the aesthetic of the film, because I mean, there's a certain, like, especially if you're doing something pro the regime, there's a certain amount of like resources you would have in Soviet Russia to make a film, but I think there's obviously going to be certain limitations to that situation, as there is with Western filmmakers, whether they've got a limited budget, no budget, or whatever. I was impressed by like the aesthetic that can come out of that sort of thing.
I agree, and that actually the roots of that, I believe, is an Aristotelian dramatic, like Aristotle's like theory of drama, which is that like something the perfect piece of dramatic work should take place within 24 hours and be basically limited to the same location the entire time. Mm-hmm. And I think I've read that Tarkovsky was shooting for that he wanted, basically their journey into the zone, all of that takes place in 24 hours in the same area. It's like right outside the town that he filmed it in Estonia. I assume it's based on Russia though, but it's like, it's like basically a town that's next to this like radiated zone where apparently, a UFO crashed, or it's like God or something existing there. There's a break. The symbolism is there's like it's a breakdown in society, it's a breakdown of semiotics, because like whenever we encounter horror and the sacred are kind of the same thing in a lot of ways. When Moses is on Mount Sinai, the cloud that the Israelites have been following, it's described as terrifying, and like as much, and like I guess like awe and glory translate to more of like a feeling of fear. And like that's why like Christ says at some point like do not fear, like he's addressing the actual terror. And so like that is kind of like, if you look at a lot of like medieval cosmological art, it depicts like demons and like the sacred as kind of these hybrid of things going on. Like with the demons, you have like, which are just fallen angels. Like you have a grotesque form of hybrid, like they're like part animal, part human, like maybe they like with Hieronymus Bosch, their mouth is in their stomach. There's this really like, what we find horrifying is the sacred order of like how we perceive things inverted. And in a lot of ways, that kind of mirrors the heavenly celestial realm, even if you're approaching this from a materialist standpoint, like something that's like perhaps beautiful and awe-inspiring is also kind of terrifying. Like with the zone, it's like you see tanks littered everywhere in Stalker, and like you hear these stories of like, oh, this stalker, like his daughter is deformed because he's been there so much, like people lost their minds going there, and to kind of gaze upon the face of God, one would lose their mind. And so I think Tarkovsky's really getting at a type of theology that's very prevalent in Orthodox, but you do see it sometimes in like some Thomist. I'm not as versed in like Thomist or Meister Eckhart and like that school of thought, but like it's called apophatic theology, which is kind of the negate. It's like negative theology, where it's like God exists outside of created matter. So to say God does not exist is actually canon for apophatic theology. So it's like God manifests through attributes and energies. Like because our five senses are limiting, so our perception of God is like, ooh, like celestial, like air, sun, moon, stars, all this stuff. But it's actually like these are still our perceptions. And perhaps like a lot of that has to do with that when Christianity hit or like kind of became what it became, it really started in Greece. And Alexander Dugin has pointed this out, where it's the thought process was really coming out of Greek polytheism, where you had Dionysian thought with the carnival, with kind of like the seasonal destruction, like kind of like a forest fire that regenerates. And then you had Apollonian order, which was kind of like the beginning of civilization, kind of associated with masculine thought of rationality, ordering things. And what Christ was this mediating zone, where it's like Christ was the ideal, crucified at a zenith on a mountain, Golgotha, but then descended into Hades in a very Dionysian manner to, preach to, in the Old Testament, basically to try and bring people out of there, and then ascended to the heavens. And like what Dugin said is like this way of thinking really blew the Greek world open, because like that, these two schools of thought of like Dionysian and Apollonian were suddenly united with that. And so I think with that thought of like ascension is something that we use our senses, our sensorial kind of perception of understanding something. But apophaticism, to tie it back to that, is that something is beyond. So like Tarkovsky's never, in Stalker, is never hinting at this is God, this is a UFO. What he's hinting at is the sacred, which is hidden. And so it's like, in an apophatic theological terms, to say God does not exist is actually accurate, because like to say God exists is to say God exists in our sensorial perceptions, and God's beyond that. God creates time, God creates matter, God creates the concept of being created. So we can't actually harness those senses to, or attach them to God. We can only assume attributes. I can talk about this at some point. This is by Saint Gregory of Nyssa. He was an early church father, and he studied at Aristotle's academy. And he was saying, when God permits Moses to see part of him, Moses goes behind a rock and he sees the back of God. But what St. Gregory's getting at, and it's really fascinating, he almost sounds like a Jungian when he's describing this, where it's like, it's the concept of the back of God. It's like to face God is to be facing good. So that means you're opposed to good. So that means it's evil. So like he sees the back, which means God is moving forward infinitely. So to follow the good is to follow the infinite. And that's what like God is like, we can't conceive of the infinite because we're finite. Like infinite is just a word we attach to not finite. So it's like he sees the back of God, but it's not like some like giant kaiju entity that's like departing into like the ether. It's more like the back of an attribute or something, that there's enough there to like quench the thirst of what yearning for something is, because you will never see it. It's always beyond. So I don't know if that made any sense at all, but that's where my head has been lately. And I was kind of just trying to prepare for this, because I'm not Orthodox, so I don't really feel I can comment like culturally on Orthodox right now, especially like with young men and contemporary culture, some of the theology. but I don't also want to speak on behalf of something that I'm not totally, I'm not converted to yet, or, so.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not that dead set on kind of what direction this goes in, but I think the association with fear and the divine is pretty evident, because every time an angel appears in the scriptures, the biblical scriptures, the first thing they say is don't be afraid, right? And
Yeah, totally.
I feel like there's this strange sort of dogmatic twist that went on in the West, because you see the Renaissance art, which very much arguably is under the Catholic schism of
Yes.
the directions in which Christianity went in, and it's
Mm-hmm.
quite dogmatic in its thinking, and you can see this coming out in the aesthetics that it projects, right? The angels are cherubs, or like awe-inspiring, but in scripture they're a bit more diffuse, and can actually, I mean, you don't even have to look at the literal descriptions of how they look to find them terrifying, because it's like the first thing they say is don't be worried, because just because you're seeing something that you can't even comprehend doesn't mean you should be fearful necessarily. I think as well,
Mm-hmm.
just to stick on the aesthetic side of things, because I think that's an interesting way of trying to understand the sort of schisms in the way that this has been taken forward. I think those, the Aristotelian kind of ideal of drama is quite interesting, because you can see how that it's probably derived from tragedies, right? And you can see how that those sort of the rules and limitations of that, where it's normally set in the same place, it's normally with a limited group of characters, it doesn't have a happy ending, and it takes place in a fixed time period, is those are limitations, right? But it's almost a limitation of maybe the physical space of Greek tragedy, where there'd be like one amphitheater, and you've got a limited community of people, this sort of stuff. But that kind of moves forward, and you can see where those rules are in place in narratives which have mimetically taken hold. For example, the crescendo of the Gospels, which is the crucifixion and the resurrection, happen in a very short period of time in one place. And then later on you see Shakespearean tragedies. Romeo and Juliet, I believe, is over a period of 24 hours, and is all set in Verona as well. I'm trying to think of a modern example, actually. I guess Stalker's one, right?
Stalker is one. I'm trying to think of like a very, man, we just have like such garbage cinema now with like all the maximalist sci-fi stuff we have.
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually, is just when you were talking, because I was like, well, my critique was going to be that, well, all the modern narratives, they will have happy endings, right? That's not necessarily true, but usually it's an unhappy ending to sell a further narrative. It's not in the same way that tragedy is a bad ending, right? Where it's like a final bad ending that tells like a parabolistic story, for example.
Yeah, and I think tragedy is where beauty is born, because beauty is fleeting. And I think Nietzsche really understood that well. And that's kind of what I meant with like the Dionysian element, is Dionysus is a tragic narrative. You know what I mean? It's like this orgiastic, like, carnival. And at some point or another, it ends with death. I can't remember the guy whose head gets cut off, Perseus, or the woman like cuts her son's head off. You could say that maybe a symbol of castration or something. But like, Mishima was really similar too. That it's like the only way for a man to live in tragedy, which is the most ideal form of life, is to beautify oneself. And him, it was a materialist kind of way, but it's like, because tragedy is that things are cut short. Christ was crucified at the age of 33, at 3 p.m. Like there's something incredibly tragic to that like just a young man being brutally and humiliated, basically. And Mishima kind of gets at a similar thing where where he was pulling from like kind of the Bushido code of honor with the samurai, where it's like I think he spent like 10 years working out, and then had himself decapitated, or committed seppuku on national TV as like a protest against what was going on in Japan. So it's like, I think that beauty of tragedy is very powerful. And yeah, I think you're kind of tapping into that, where it's under this limited finite set of rules and allows for something to occur, but it's like, that's kind of what allows for beauty to exist, is that something is cut short. Youth is beautiful because youth is fleeting.
Yeah, the Mishima one's interesting. I need to get into what he actually wrote because I'm not read on him at all, but I kind of curiously looked into what went on there. And it's, again, coming back to how the writer kind of glorifies himself, because his sort of obsession with his physical form, and then this kind of almost deliberately holding the most ridiculous revolution that was never going to succeed, almost in service to the tragedy, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know, there's I fine line. It depends on your interpretation of whether that's similar to Christ going through with things despite knowing what was going to happen, or whether it's, like I said, it's a more of an ego thing where he's like, I want to get my name in the history books, so I'm going to do this crazy thing.
There's some inversions going on. Mishima was Sun and Steel. He references Bataille, so there's kind of the Bataille has a lot of inversions with kind of like based materialism and like finding the sacred and kind of filth and stuff. But in a lot of ways, Christ was born, in a area that was covered in animal feces and stuff. So I mean, it's kind of, you do have some inversions at play where it's like the celestial king is like born in absolute poverty and filth, in a derelict. And so it's kind of, I think there is something to that where the sacred is close to the profane, and like it's kind of the same way where like demons are just angels, but their nature has permanently been inverted, so they're hideous looking, versus like angels, it's like thought is that they're so beautiful, or that it's terrifying to people. And it's like this breaking down of what our perceptions of things are, like seeing a color that doesn't exist. That I think H.P. Lovecraft would try to like describe that in some of his short stories, is it's like beholding kind of again, H.P. Lovecraft very different than Christianity, but I mean there's something kind of similar where it's like you're trying to describe something that can't be described. It's like a color that doesn't exist. Yeah, I kind of lost where I was going with that. But yeah, I mean, I think with Catholicism and the Renaissance, that a lot of that art is still very influenced by Greek mythology, like the idea of like a god being like a bearded man in the clouds and stuff. That's that's still a very literal interpretation that's kind of infused. It's basically Zeus. You know what I mean? So it's like when a lot of people like describe Christianity, I think they're imagining something more or less like like Zeus, like this beautiful old man with a beard or something in the clouds, the devil being something with horns and like a behemoth looking or like evil looking creature. But in all fairness, I think like Lucifer was supposed to be very beautiful and stuff. So there are some inversions there.
I suppose that's kind of, and going back to aesthetics again, it's kind of the reason for that is kind of it's an aesthetic hangover from the fact that it had to take over from those very European forms of paganism, which have all these motifs in them. And it just kind of stuck around, because you see, I mean, like Milton's very interesting because in Paradise Lost, you see like a lot of the like confrontation scenes where there's a battle scene between the fallen angels and the other angels, they're almost directly influenced from the prose in the Iliad, for example.
Yeah.
Which is strange. But again, yeah, I think you're right in the figure of demons or the devil, because again, that comes up in Milton where the devil's a seductive character. He's not a
totally
hideous monster, right?
No, I mean, it would be too easy to invent a dualist situation if he was, hideous looking, you know. It's more, yeah, seductive. Um, it's funny, yeah, bringing up what you were saying with, aesthetics and Christianity is like, I think time and time again, you see, I mean, in its pure sense, I would say Christianity hasn't always followed this, but like, um, a lot of the pagan religions really paved the way for Christian thought. And, you could see that as, God uses time in a way that we cannot understand, like allowing a certain belief system to take hold and then allowing for something else to come through. He spends 2 testaments to fulfill law and stuff. Because like a friend of mine was saying, it's like up in Alaska, the Orthodox and Anglican churches still retain all the aesthetics and some of the ceremonial practices of the Native Americans there, because like they sought to, convert them, but in a lot of ways they didn't change their culture. They just kind of like were absorbed in it. And like Orthodox, that I find very fascinating, which you don't find in Catholicism and Protestantism, is like Orthodox like affirms other belief systems. Like it's not like this like strictly monotheistic kind of thing. Like it's like the hypostatic trinity, like what other pagan religions were worshiping might have been valid. Like they might have been having valid experiences. Perhaps they were, worshiping demons or inferior entities, but Yahweh is higher and stuff. So it's kind of, there is this kind of interesting thing where you see kind of a postmodern thing happening of like Christianity being absorbed into other cultures and not changing it, but also mutating with it. It's kind of, you see these like early, Protestantism, I think, took this to like a really extreme end where it's kind of almost mimicking culture, and I think loses something at the same time in that. But like, so it's like Roman Catholicism was kind of, and you can see a lot of Lutheranism in Scandinavia kind of mirroring some of Scandinavia's pagan belief systems and stuff. You see this kind of like, there is a relationship going on. It's not this like colonialist, imperialist thing that happened, but like not, that's not in its pure form. I mean, I guess like there's that one, was it I think it was Martin Scorsese did a film about the Catholic or Jesuit ministers in Japan. And there's this scene where Liam Neeson he's this guy who's lost his faith and he's become like a Buddhist amongst the Japanese. I think this is like Shinto.
Jesus, that film is amazing. I can't remember what it's
It's
called.
incredible. Yeah.
What is that? Oh, that was an amazing film. That was an amazing film.
Gotta grab my phone charger.
Yeah,
and like describing how you can't have like Latin mass does not translate to the Japanese, and these concepts that you're trying to sell with Christianity, like these just don't register, because like Japanese is like a symbol-based language, like just their way of interfacing with the world. Versus, I guess, when the Orthodox came later, they actually were attending like Shinto shrines and stuff, trying to understand like how the culture operated. So there's this difficulty where it's like like certain areas of the world just can't grasp like the kind of Thomist thought process of Catholicism and even the subsequent kind of Lutheranism, Protestantism. And so it's like a lot of ways you still have to kind of understand like where a sacred element is going on with a pagan belief and like how that translates. Again, it's fascinating to think about. I mean, I'm not an expert on any of it, but that movie is incredible though.
The Liam Neeson film it's Silence. I just looked it up.
Yeah.
It's an absolutely brutal film, and I think it's
brutal.
Required watching, maybe more so if you're not of a religiously inclined mind, because I think from a historical perspective, it's very difficult for us to understand how violently important these sort of, these metaphysical beliefs were, religiously metaphysical beliefs were to people, because again, it's absolutely brutal, just showing the oppression of, the Christian minority in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know about the Orthodox influence in Japan, actually, but I know that the obviously Buddhism was a massive thing throughout Asia, and it,
Mm-hmm.
through, whether you would say it's through the ability of religions to adapt, or whether it's just the sheer brutality of the Japanese control structure. That obviously is pretty much analogous in Japan to Shinto. Like, they're pretty much the same thing. Like, they became one in a way.
Yeah, and I guess like Shinto, for as secular as Japan is, I guess apparently like the rivaling buildings is 7-Elevens and Shinto shrines
Mm-hmm.
in terms of quantity throughout Japan.
This is,
I mean, go ahead.
This is the thing, though, because I think in the West we wrongly assume that religiosity has got something to do with like an absolute hardline projecting outwards. This is sort of the caricature of and critique of maybe Catholic and later hardline Protestant Christianities, is that they dogmatize the metaphysical thinking and then take it on a almost like colonialist bent to expand itself, to to expand the one truth the way they see it. And
yeah, well, I mean, Dostoevsky talks about this in the Brothers Karamazov with the Grand Inquisitor. Is you have like, if Christ were to come back, we would probably crucify him again and lock him up in a prison, and it's kind of like the Dostoevsky again. He's a hard Orthodox and very much a pro-Russia guy, which I get. So he's critiquing Catholicism's rationalism and then Protestantism's lack of spiritual asceticism, and like basically it's like we try with religion to make it. Religion is a lot like art in this way, where it's not really like a functioning utility, so to say. Like, kind of the majesty of art objects is that they're not important. I heard Barrett say that recently on his Contain podcast. It's like that they just exist, and like with religion, it's kind of similar. It kind of prevents, as Derrida described, Christianity especially like prevents decadence from taking hold. And so it's like, it's always this like breaking system. And I think like Catholicism and a lot of Protestantism are these answers to the modern world being born. Is like, we need to, like, we see the importance of religion, like we can see that the moral system helps keep a good population in check. Catholicism kind of invented the kind of, good deeds to get into heaven, almost like a quantity system or something, like a debt-based system, which was not originally there.
Well, that was because it was literally attached to money by the Catholic Church as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if Christ came back, it would be a real big issue for these kind of the way we've systematized religion of being, it's something that you go for an hour a day, 1 day a week, and that's it. And we just keep it there at that. But it's like the Orthodox, and this is the challenging part of the Orthodox, is it's much more demanding. There's fasting, there's, multiple services a week. It's a very rigorous approach. And it's like, the reality is it's like, if this and I'm not totally 100% sold on Orthodox, but it does theologically just make a lot more sense to me, is it's like, if this is true, like nothing else matters really. Like this, like Nietzsche said, it's like, we can't, Nietzsche was like, because Christianity happened, we can't escape it. It's like, we're kind of like stuck in this thing because of what happened with it. Mm-hmm. And, that's the part that is, that's the puzzling element of it.
The strangest thing is that Protestantism became so evolutionary and so tolerant that it no longer asserted any metaphysical supernaturalism. Like, I would say that materialism and is just an offshoot of Protestantism, basically, in the Enlightenment.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that Protestantism is a product of the printing press, the cult of rationality, and materialism. And like I've spent a majority. I'm technically Anglican, so I've spent time in the Episcopal Church, which is kind of just like a more stripped down liberal version of Orthodoxy. And it's totally changed, so I don't really attend it anymore. But I've also spent a lot of time, when I was a teenager, especially with my family, going to like, Presbyterian churches. And it's like, yeah, I mean, there's no concept of the supernatural. I mean, the Eucharist is seen as a symbolic gesture, but it's not like there's any sort of process throughout the liturgical or the liturgy of transmuting it into the blood and body of Christ, which is a much more visceral thing. It's like, it's like almost vampiric and, cannibalistic, where you're like, I'm eating of flesh and blood of like the divine being that has sacrificed itself. Like, it's very visceral. And I think with Protestantism, you have this stripping away of the kind of violent, terrifying elements of Christianity. I'm not saying this to get off on like some sort of horror movie thing, but there is something really horrifying in Christianity. There's something really frightening about it. Mm-hmm. It's heavily symbolic and, culminates in a universal tragedy, across the board, even if you believe it or not. So, well, yeah, Protestantism,
the universal symbol of Christianity is a symbol of the ideal's torture.
Yeah, and sacrifice. Mm-hmm. I think Protestantism, we're kind of seeing the fruits of it now. Especially like in this kind of cultural moment we're in where, and I'm not totally against Protestantism because like, I'm technically still approaching a lot of things from a Protestant mind. And like, my family members are all devout Protestant. I don't hold like some sort of harsh ecumenical view on things. But I think you do see a lot of like frustration amongst a lot of Protestants where, it's mutable. Like versus Orthodoxy and even some parts of Catholicism, kind of like they aren't immutable. Like it's like it stays firm in its belief system versus a lot of Protestantism. Now you get these I think there's like 10,000 Protestant churches now. Its existence in multiplicity is kind of losing the kind of sacred center of it, like it's becoming more and more. Someone said it's the postmodern Christianity in a lot of ways. So I do have respect for it. Like I think it's kind of my issue with Orthodox right now is that it's kind of captured culturally. And again, not by everyone. Like I have friends who are Orthodox and they're not this way, but it is captured culturally right now by a certain zealousness of like trad adjacent kind of thought of like, we just need to go back. That's all you do. That's how we'll solve the problems. We just need to go back. And I think the issue with that is you're still operating from like the modern world happened and like it was permitted, like if God didn't want the modern world to happen, you could have, or, could have been eradicated. We could have had the flood part 2 or something. So it's like this kind of, there's this escapist kind of, my phone keeps dying. Let's see. Hold on. Is that working yet? Let's see. Sorry, my for some reason my phone is. Let's see. All right, I hope that works. Apologies. I didn't sleep very well last night, so I was on my phone in a response to that. Because whenever I wake up at 3 a.m. I worry the demons are in my room because that's when they're permitted to they're permitted more freedom in our world and agency because it's Christ was crucified on 3 p.m. Demons come out at 3 a.m. But that that could be some superstition. But what was I getting at?
I think the thread of tradition is important there because, like you said, it's being like fetishized, and it's always been fetishized by certain people. I think one of the if you read a lot of philosophical people, I think, and this is definitely present in Nietzsche, is the sort of fetishization of the world of antiquity.
Oh yeah, totally.
Like it just, you either you get two kinds of philosophers: someone who's completely not interested in ancient philosophy, and someone who is completely obsessed, and that's all they read. And it's like almost like the ultimate trad is we need to go back to Plato, and everything needs to be the Republic or something like that.
Yeah, and I think you get a certain amount of like a philosophy built on like fear, where it's like if we just go back to this and this and this, we're fine, and like that's we had things right. And it's like, because I would even say like Dugan is like a full-on trad guy. Like he's really postmodern, and like I'm more interested in like avant-garde and like tradition coming together more than I am like just strict tradition or strict avant-garde. And like yeah, Nietzsche definitely gets that. It's like just the fetishization of the past is just kind of, it's adjacent to just nostalgia and for something you don't even know or experience. So there's an escapist element to that. And like, unfortunately, orthodoxy is being confronted by that, especially like in a kind of a male dominated group that resents the modern world, but found Christianity. There's a good, like, you get a lot of like hatred towards Protestantism and Catholicism because of it. And it's like, some of it's warranted, some of it's like just still resentment. And it's like, I think that's a big issue that I think a lot of the Christian churches are all being tested right now personally. Like you see, no one really trusts the Catholic Church, even though it's kind of the meeting point between the Orthodox world and the Protestant world. And then like, the Anglican Church has just gone so liberal that like, it doesn't really resemble a Christian religion anymore. It becomes more of like whatever's the most topical, radical thing to do. And then you have the Protestant Church where it's so spiritually dead that like, it's more likely to like hatch people going to like the occult or, other things. So I think the thing facing orthodoxy is kind of the resentment, to quote Nietzsche, of like certain subsets of groups. Like it's like, and it's easy to fall into that where you like can resent the modern world because it's like, oh, we have the dismantling of communities, like, the loss of the sacred. And, we live in this kind of like hyper atomized world that's isolating and like culture is being flattened. So it's like, it's easy to escape to the Orthodox world and be like, oh yeah, it's it's like Byzantine art is still embraced. There's still craft and tradition. You can be an icon artist, and there's nothing against that. Like I have a friend who's doing that, and he's great, and he's really well read about this. And it's like, but I think there is a certain level of like, people adopt aesthetics as identities, and I think that's the difficulty. And I'm not saying their beliefs are incorrect, but I think one should ask themselves that as like, is this a trad adjacent impulse or something?
Yeah, I'm gonna throw some shade because it's one of the strands I can actually talk about. I think it's pretty obvious to me that the Anglican Church is the arm of the BBC, and the BBC is an arm of the British government at this point. So
yeah,
at least that's totally my experience over here. But yeah, I think what we're getting at is that you can call it trad or whatever, but I think when it comes down to it, in terms of an idea and someone's outlook and inlook, the worst ideas, and they tend to be dogmatic in the sense that the most zealous people of any ideology or religion are recent converts, is that these really bad ideas, these really dogmatic, boneheaded ideas come from reaction. They come from reactionary thought.
Yeah.
And they're not, I don't want to get too rationalist about this because I'm definitely not, I wouldn't consider myself a rationalist, but then there's no kind of taking a step back and wondering how we got here. It's just, let's just go the complete other direction. Like, for example, like I said, that the extreme Protestantisms in, tandem with Enlightenment thought, and in reaction to the authoritarianism of Europe, just they became Enlightenment and materialist and lost any of their, tradition or supernaturalism. In the same way that in a reaction to the modern world, a right-leaning person might immediately say, oh, I need to go to the most perceptually like perceived right wing like church there is, which is, you know, Orthodox or something like that.
Exactly. And that's the issue that people run into, is the impulsive overcorrection, I think. That when things are out of balance, like there is this extreme, yeah, and like the Orthodox Church to kind of provide sometimes like more extremist males like a kind of it's like a buttressing zone, and like you can work through it, and it's like, you know, like I think this critique is not heretical to say, because I've read some like Orthodox monks and church fathers who have said this happens, you know, where that like you get like truth, you know, like Orthodox really, when you read it, it's like, oh my God, it's just like like this is how it went. And it's like I can sell a lot of people on Orthodox, you know, apophatic theology, the mystical like qualities of it. I mean, there's a lot of really alluring stuff there that can really make a case for Christianity, you know, for what it's kind of depleted state that it's in right now. But the issue is it's like when you have something that resembles the truth in a very compelling way, there's a tendency for it to play on the pride and the ego, where it's like suddenly it's like I have this, and it's like because you're approaching it from this kind of I feel rejected by the modern world, which is why you kind of get a lot of men going to Orthodoxy. And then it's like, but I have the truth now. So it's this like gnosis. There's suddenly a Gnostic element of like having knowledge above other people. And that's not the way you should be going about it. And that's the issue I think that the Orthodox Church is facing, you know, and that's why I think that all these churches are facing their own issues right now. And, you know, Orthodox is that it's, you know, maintains something that is really important, you know, that its other predecessors have abandoned. But because of that, it's now facing a similar issue that its predecessors have paved the way for. Hold on, my phone, I don't know if it's charging or not. I need to make sure. I don't want this to cut out. I don't know why the charger is not working. It's a brand new charger. Could just unplug all this. Okay, if this cuts out, I'm gonna have to DM you, but I don't know if it will. Let me see. Okay, my phone's charging. It was red for so long I couldn't really tell. Yeah. Go ahead. I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm really enjoying this conversation though.
Yeah, I think so. Again, I'm gonna commit a nice Christian sin and start talking about myself.
Oh, dude, go right ahead. I love it. Yeah, go right ahead. I'm all about indulgences.
You know, noticing. I mean, like, you know, I would, as someone who's been, I guess I wouldn't say atheistically minded, but pretty agnostic and indifferent towards the religious metaphysics. But feeling a weird sort of aesthetic attraction towards them, which I think, again, like you said, I think a lot of people do. And
yeah,
again, like
totally.
I said, their reaction is this dogmatic, oh, I need to flip everything in the other direction. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot for my upcoming book is, and I know it's not necessarily all to do with, you know, metaphysical beliefs and propositions and all this sort of stuff, but kind of thinking about, okay, what is metaphysics? Because that's what separates my suspension of belief, someone else's metaphysical like rejection of a deity, and someone else's metaphysical assertion of a deity, right? I think, and maybe this is a good way to test my theory, I think that metaphysics, whether it's mine, an atheist, or someone who's religious, they're all equally opinion. And the important thing is not necessarily, for us at least, the truth of that opinion, because they are opinion, and this goes back to the divine, right? Because we don't have access to the divine, right?
Nope. Well,
anything short of a metaphysical miracle, which is, you know, me being in the desert and the angel Gabriel coming down and telling me the truth or whatever. anything short of that, I have to be skeptical about the propositional truth of this. But that's not the interesting thing. I think this was something that came up in our last discussion, because I said some offhand comment about, I'd love it if everyone else in the world was a really devout Christian and I can just do what I want, right? Because everyone would forgive me all the time.
Well, yeah, then you can be, yeah. Well, then you could be you could be the radical minority, which is the issue we're running into, is no one's a Christian now. So Christianity is becoming the radical minority.
Yeah. But I'm
at least in the West.
Propositional like forgiveness, and it's like, okay, well, you don't hate me, but you can hate my sins. I don't care about that. Whatever, I'm going to do them anyway.
Yeah.
It's not really going to matter. But I thought that sort of put me on a train of thought into thinking that the important thing about metaphysics, again, short of any metaphysical miracle, because I do think that revealed truth could exist. I'm not anti the fact that a metaphysical miracle could happen. But the important thing about metaphysics is the downstream effect it has on us.
Yeah.
And this is why what I was saying about, I'm kind of caricaturing and saying, oh, Christians are going to be meek and let me do what I want and not and let me be king of the world or whatever. But
right, it's
almost like, these metaphysical propositions have a downstream effect on who we are, because again, if you're negating any sort of non-material eschatology, metaphysically speaking, then all that matters is the here and now, the physical stuff that's going to happen. If you've got a future metaphysic, then that affects how you act here and now.
Yep.
So do you agree with that train of thought, or?
Well, I think you're almost actually sounding like a Christian with what you're saying, because, in in Christian metaphysics, human beings are given a soul, and we have a two-part nature. So we're both flesh and spirit. And, the reason the angels that fell with Lucifer can't be saved, why they're demons, is because their nature is one. Like, they're only celestial. So we are celestial and body. So that kind of gives us the ability to, over time, in theosis, as it's called, for God to dwell within us and to kind of raise ourselves. Like, I mean, on a practical way, Christianity is like the religion of self-improvement, on a very, base materialist standpoint, and so it's, the whole meek, self-hating Christian thing, I can't stand that. I think it's like bugmen kind of things, because it's like you're working, the way that Orthodox also see it is like you're working out salvation throughout your lifetime, and like that is an uphill journey. So it's like there already is the narrative of ascent, versus like if you believe in nothing, I mean, it's you kind of can go. I'm trying to explain this as best I can. Someone who only seeks base material means, you're only really operating like an animal. An animal operates by its senses without any sort of future in mind, and that's what you're saying with the Christian metaphysics. A dog comes and sniffs something because it attracts it, it eats, it urinates or defecates, rubs, it likes pleasure, getting its ears scratched or something. Like, it operates from that. It's not in some sort of concept operating from like a legacy or from where it would like to get to. We have the idea of ascent and, narrative movement forward, which is kind of why there's a bit of a nihilistic quality when you have like cyclical time, like religions like that embrace cyclical time have a certain like nihilistic quality to it, where it's like, oh, this doesn't even matter, you're going to be reborn and stuff. But it's like if you're confronted with the idea of individualism, as Kierkegaard would say, Christianity is the religion of the individual, where it's the individual before God. You have a little bit of God in you, and like that, we have divine nature, which means free will. God does not ask you to believe in him. It's a desire to believe for you to believe in him. It's not like a sort of, a lot of Christians, I know this, like they kind of get on this, like they don't want freedom. And so they want to be micromanaged. And that's kind of the allure, I think, of religion and Christianity is like, you know, it's like, I don't want responsibility for my life. I want God to tell me to do everything to do. And it's not really like that. Like you really do have a lot of agency over your life. You know, like the thing that makes human beings share in divinity is that we have free will, and you have, you know, spirit, you can cultivate spiritual discernment over things. And I think that's the part that working out salvation is actually working with our kind of stubborn nature that actually resembles some of the divine, that we have some sort of, we can create worlds, we can create technology, we can create things, you know, we share in that kind of metaphor in a lot of ways, you know. And so you kind of do get to do what you want, you know. And it's like a lot of the, you know, the morals of Christianity, which is honestly just a rationalization of their importance. You know, like I remember I read somewhere that Bill Gates likes Catholicism because of the moral aspect, and hates or doesn't like anything else of it. I don't know if that's true or not with him, but you know, I'm still seeing that where it's like, yeah, you're seeing the utility of something. Like Christianity's moral structure helped Europe flourish. And basically that also paved its end in Europe, because then eventually we developed a sort of hubris, or, you know, like, you know, the Enlightenment came and we could think out of things. But it's like, in a lot of ways, that's still kind of false. Like, it's like this sort of like Coinbase system of like, oh, good deeds, you know, not sinning and all this stuff gets me to heaven. It's like anything that's a sin is just a virtue turned on its head, an inversion there. So it's like, you know, like you're allowed to drink in Christianity, you know, like drunkenness is not encouraged, but like drunkenness is not encouraged in our entire culture. Like we operate in a Christian culture, whether we realize it or not. Like, you know, like you're like allowed sex, you know, it's stated it should be with one person, because in a lot of ways that actually makes society operate a lot better too. Because it's like, if one dude is like getting every woman in a group, like it's going to make a lot of resentful men, you know. There's certain ways that makes, yeah, it has this practical usage, but it's also like it's kind of like in the structure Aristotelian tragedy, you know. It's like there's parameters set that allow for transcendence, you know. If you have every option, chances are you're not going to be very creative. So I think there is a lot of, you know, independent, like I think forgiveness and all that stuff is very important, and it allows people to be more patient with one another. It allows for like kind of, it puts a break on things like racism or, you know, misogynistic chivalry or things. Like there are good things, like empirically. I think a lot of it is also just learning to ascend. I don't know. I guess that's, man, I'm not doing a great job in the latter half of explaining this, but I mean, in a lot of ways, I do agree with you. And I think you're actually getting closer to a Christian understanding of things in that regard.
Yeah, I think the metaphysics, by nature of the fact that, and again, might step on toes in terms of saying, well, actually, I do think there's a metaphysical truth, right? But yeah, I'm trying to really think about this philosophically, is that by nature of it being opinion, it's inherently not rational, actually.
But like, but rationality is just an employment of the mind. I mean, it only goes so far, you know. I mean, if everything is based in opposites, wouldn't there be something called irrationality? You know, like when we're so addicted to horror movies now, which is so much about the dismantling of the rationality. That's where fear seeps in. Like people are like, culture more than ever is addicted to horror movies. I mean, you go on Netflix and that's all that's streaming is horror movies. And it's like, what is that? A breakdown of rationality. And so the addiction to that is, people are obsessed with some level of like the frontier of rationality departing. Like it's the very thing that keeps like our civilization going in a flimsy way, but it's also the very thing that people are addicted to. Like intoxication is its own form of like the breaking down of irrationality of rationality, you know? So like, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it like rationality, like you said, it's us putting our logic on the like infinitely complex world in front of us. And by nature, rationality wants to numberize things, so we can, you know, we can look at morality and it immediately leads to its end point, which is a numberized social credit system.
But if you add the transcendent element with it, it becomes, as Kierkegaard says, the individual before God. You know, it's like the problem that a lot of the progressive left is having is that they're basically hyper Christians, but they don't believe in God and they hate Christianity. So it's like, it's more of their credit score of like moral performance. You know, again, I'm kind of burned out on like critiquing left or right. But I mean, it is kind of what's going on. I mean, it's, you know, it's like if you don't have the moral credit score is not going to get you a place in heaven. You know, it's just going to get you favor amongst the peers. So it's actually just appealing to your pride. Like it's, you know, I think the difficulty is, I mean, faith is an irrational thing. And that's kind of what I was getting at with like the idiot and like idiotism or God's fool or idiot or fool for God is like, it's kind of the person that stares at the sun, you know, like Van Gogh did. You know, Van Gogh stared at the sun and hurt his eyes, and, you know, cut his ear off, shot himself in the stomach. I mean, when he was, before the church threw him out, he gave up his quarters that the church gave him as a minister to the coal miners in Belgium. And then he slept in the coal mine. But he's probably the greatest artist of all time. You know, he's the bridging point with the traditional world and the modern world. And he's the person that kind of birthed the cult of the artistic personality in a lot of ways. Like, it's no small thing that happened. And I think that's this bridging point of the irrational and the irrational. And like, you know, why would you do these things? But it's like, at the same time, it's like, you look at the artistic gift that he cultivated. He suffered greatly, but he also brought something. There's something to suffering, I think. And I think the Christian narrative is the only way that answers that like, why is suffering important? And it's like, you know, because this world has fallen and like, we're trying to ascend to something higher. And so it's like, if you just, this is the issue Marx runs into, is it's like, suffering is something we can cure by utopia or something. And it's like, you know, the only way you can do that is cure human beings of being human beings. You know, the irrational nature of human beings of falling in love, the irrational nature of desire or other things. Like, you really, if you want to have a world that is completely harmonious in a physical sense, you have to almost cure human beings of being human beings.
Yeah, and the cult of rationality. To go back to your point about the proliferation of horror films.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is something I've actually looked into a little bit, and I hope I'm not going to say anything incorrect here, because I was fascinated with this when I found it out. I don't think these films are so much popular as in, like, you know, everyone goes to the cinema to see the new Marvel film or whatever, right? Right. Everyone, including everyone in China or whatever. The thing about these horror films, especially since films such as Paranormal Activity, and even going back to, like, you know, bad 80s and 70s B movies, is that they're actually they're not like the high art, they're not the most popular, they're not generally the thing that everyone goes to see, but they're low risk enough because enough people go to see them. They're relative to the amount of people who go to see them or buy them, they're really low budget in terms of films. And this is, again, where the cult of rationality has not even led to making the most popular thing. Because, for example, Shakespeare is very popular, but it's led to creating something that's the lowest risk. Shakespeare was a very popular writer because he took risks. There's subtle digs at the elites in his society in his writings.
Yeah, totally. And you see he plays with gender personae. I mean, he's both hyper, you know, progressive and very traditional at the same time. You know, I mean, he's I mean, it's I mean, look, yeah, I mean, does like a culture of horror movies create a healthy culture? You know, and like there's a rationality of, yes, this produces capital to like create more horror films, but it's also so dumb. But I think it's because it's a cheap way of getting to the divine. You know what I mean? You see like ghost shows are so popular on TV, and it's like, or like looking for Bigfoot or like all this stuff, and it's like, you know, I was into that stuff when I was, you know, a lot younger. You know, just scary stuff. You know, seeking that stuff out. You know, interest in the occult and stuff, and it's like a lot of that is and this whole peak experience thing, a lot of that is the breaking down of rationality. Like you're trying to seek something that doesn't make sense, and like almost like it's kind of what I said, like you can never gaze upon the face of God because you'll die or you will be evil, which is to be without, like as Dugan would say, like the modernity's ultimate arrival is the post-human, without human. To create a better society materially, you have to cure people of being people, which is this is my dig on the transhumanist movement, is like to not be human, to not exist, to be a machine, to be gray, you know, to be without to be human is to have responsibility, and to have responsibility is to be free, which is what we are given by God. Mm-hmm. And like whenever like the draconian authoritarianism comes in, it tries to create something that is seamless. Like a lot of modernity that Dugan was saying in Fourth Political Theory is fascism, communism, and liberalism competing to try to be more efficient. Efficiency is almost like the antithesis of being human in a lot of ways, you know, and there's an importance of efficiency, but it's like, you know, look at the culture we're engendering. You know, it's like an obsession with horror movies. And again, I'm not even that against horror movies. I've watched some good horror movies. I'm watching V right now, which is a Russian one that's an adaptation of the Nikolai Gogol short story. Like it's quite good. And there's an importance to that. You know, the parables, pagan tales and stuff, like all those, like, you know, old wives' tales and stuff, like things that were about terror and things in the woods and stuff. There is a reality to that, but it's like, I think the rationality is just making more of it because it makes money, but it actually is like so low risk, so low brow that it's actually just kind of keeping people in this like spectacle based Pavlovian response, you know?
I think the transhuman thing's really important, and
yeah,
it's going to become more important as we
progress
into the future, the soon to come future. Because again, go back to metaphysics for a second and how these things downstream affect the way we act. Is that like every metaphysics implies an eschatology.
Yeah.
So like a transhuman metaphysic implies a transhuman eschatology. And
yes,
the very thing, and we've brought this up several times, basically, is that humans are irrational, and this is the final form of the cult of rationality, is removing every irrational part of the human.
Yeah, exactly. It's the human instrumentality project that Jele does in Neon Genesis. It's like that everyone becomes just like an orange goo, devoid of individual uniqueness, and you know, like that. It's the dissolving into a fluid, and like, you know, it's horrible. Like it's like everyone's thoughts. It's like pure chaos. Everyone, like if we were all dissolved, and our entire like cognizant hemisphere was like Twitter, where it's just like a billion trillion different narratives going on at every split second. It's just that's hell. That is like what hell is. Hell is to be completely without and to be so chaotic at the same time that it's that there's no difference, there is no border, there is no form there. And that is, I think that, I do agree with Dugan on this. I think that like beyond the post-human is where the devil is to be without, we from the fall developed a sort of nocturnal nature of human beings, where it's like, in Notes in the Underground by Dostoevsky, he kind of is like alluding to kind of someone, like if you give someone everything, they're still going to have some sort of irrational desire to kill someone or to possess something, because there's this side of the human nature that can't be quelled. And I think the only response to that is that, there's a bastardized nature that we're existing in. And the whole point is to kind of, theosis is the concept of the Holy Spirit dwelling within the human being. And so the process of ascetic struggle is the quelling of that nature within this lifetime. And that there are accounts in the Orthodox in particular, but I think, you could probably make a case that Protestant and Catholics have also, because I'm trying to really not dunk on Protestantism or Catholicism. I really hate when ortho bros talk shit on the other people's faiths, but it's like, there are accounts in the Orthodox, St. John of Maximovich in San Francisco, where he glowed with a particular light. Like in his lifetime, he was able to levitate, apparently, and like, again, this requires faith that these things existed. But, I personally am someone who I lived in a haunted apartment. I experienced demonic activity on a very physical level. These things exist. Why does not the polar opposite exist? Something that is good, something that like actually brings people closer to something, and on the very level, it's the anti of the post-human, and I just don't think the post-human everyone unequivocally agrees social media is toxic, but we're stuck with it. I'm not like, we need to destroy it. Like, I'm still a modernist in that way, but it's like, people unequivocally agree that like progress is kind of driving us all insane, I
was just thinking about how this is why tragedy is kind of the best narrative, or at least the most mimetic narrative form, is because it's a sad story where humans fuck up, basically. Mm-hmm. And those stories aren't going to exist if we're purely rational or have any like mimetic power whatsoever.
Would Romeo and Juliet be beautiful if they lived happily ever after and became a bickering old couple?
Yes.
No,
it's the two families went to counseling together and resolved.
Yeah, like that's like, sure, there's drama in there, but it's like, it's the whole thing that gives it its like potency is that it's like they kill themselves. Again, I'm not pro suicide, but it's like, that's the point that Mishima's getting at too, is it's like it's the reason we cut flowers. And again, there's a beauty to decayed flowers. Dried dead flowers, that's its own aesthetic, but it's like, why do we cut a flower off at its stem when it's at its peak beauty and try to artificially preserve it in water? Like, that's kind of there's a tragedy in cutting it at its stem, and trying to just appreciate that one moment it becomes an object as opposed to an organism. It's trying to become, that's like what art is in a lot of ways, is that we're trying to imbue like a sense, and I think that's kind of why art has been suffering lately in our world, is that we're trying to make life art. Mark Zuckerberg is trying to make life aestheticized as opposed to like the movement of decay itself. And art is that one moment of trying to be able to capture something and leave it crystallized, not fossilized, but crystallized in this moment. And Romeo and Juliet were that, and that they killed themselves at that moment. And, that crystallized that burning passion you have for someone,
Mm.
you know, because it's like passion dies away, like love becomes maturity and like other things, but it's like that kind of ecstatic beauty of, and like almost like insanity that goes that, Van Gogh understood that, like his kind of insanity also bred that beauty at the same time. And it's like those crystallized moments before, if you don't have that, you have decay, which has, I do have my own love of decay, but it's like we're trying to eliminate tragedy by crystallizing things, but in doing that we gray everything over in the transhumanist movement. People, when they can live inside an avatar, don't have to pay attention to like themselves getting older. And getting older also just means responsibility, exercising, eating healthier, not living the hubris of youth out. There is a sort of, the sun is setting on a certain thing, and you have to, and it requires responsibility, especially if you want to maintain like a certain vitality towards life. That's what responsibility is versus, some form of fossilized, calcified decadence that we're trying to maintain with a transhumanist movement.
Yeah, I think the aesthetics of decay oxymoronically make something more timeless. One of the things that like very regularly comes to my mind, if you're in any of the churches or castles of Europe, they will inevitably have some sort of fresco or mosaic or architecture where there was once some gilded gold leaf, or tapestries which are now incredibly faded. And the first thought I always have is, this place must have been amazing in its heyday, like, because you look at them now and they look a bit spooky because they're dated and preserved as best.
Yeah, there's a hauntology to them or something.
Yeah, and this is why I think that paintings are timeless in a way that a lot of the digital stuff isn't, ironically, because the digital stuff we think about is timeless, right? If you take a picture or a scan of any great painting, which they do in the name of preservation, it doesn't, although in a way it's got higher resolution than the human eye, they do several scans where they can x-ray and get below the paint and and maybe restore it and do all this stuff. Is it loses the thing which was the original painting, which by nature of the fact that we have to do preservation work and scan it now so we don't lose the painting, it almost adds to the timeless quality of the original thing, like oxymoronically. Again, getting back to the irrationality of aesthetics and humanity.
Well, it's
no sense, does it? But there we are.
It makes no sense, but we people flock, pre the mechanical age of reproduction. It's like people would flock to other countries and make these pilgrimages to go just see a small painting or something. There's a certain like irrationality to that, why that like lives within the human spirit, and like
millions of people every year from all over the world fly to the Louvre or the Vatican and to see the Sistine Chapel in person. They're amazing. On the Vatican's website, you can do an amazing 3D tour of the Sistine Chapel. You can zoom in microscopically on every single part of it. But there's a difference between these two things.
Yeah.
I don't think the Sistine Chapel of the metaverse is going to compare, to be honest with you.
No, I don't think it will. And I think Van Gogh said it really well, where it's, our artists, and I feel this way all the time, and it actually like brings me to despair sometimes, and maybe that's just the desire to be an artist requires a certain level of despair in that way. But it's like our objects to create art are blunt, and like we reach for the transcendent in that way, and like we're clumsy and like, and I think it's in that, like, because I think this all the time, where I was like, man, I'm drawing with ink in like alone in this room in this digital world, and it's like I'm not even like a real painter. I'm like a draftsman, I'm like a slightly more advanced graphic artist, and like, but I'm trying so hard with like ink. And there's this despair that comes over of just like that, like you can't reach this thing this ideal that you want so badly. And like, Van Gogh gets that, and he pairs it with, Christ creates men, not statues. And it's like every moment of waking life is a work of art. Like, it's like when we create a sculpture, I thought about this seeing Louis Bourgeois' spider sculptures when I used to work at Hauser and Wirth. Like, the rain and the floodlights would hit this sculpture so differently. And I was like, this is what it means to have a physical object living in the world. Is like, it is subject to the natural elements. It is still participating in the natural world. There isn't some like digital thing that is curating it algorithmically how it's going to be responded to. It's you create something kind of in the way an infant is created, and you let it exist in the world, very well aware of that it's being exposed to pollen, sickness, tragedy, and like, but also sun rays and beauty and stuff. And it's like, that is like this decay and vitality existing at the same time. And it's like, I think what the problem is it's like science fiction has an allure to it. Blade Runner and Aliens were favorite movies of mine, still are, but it's like, they glorify like a future dystopian world. Like, there is a certain fetishism of it, but it's like, you're just going to get the low vibrational world. Like, our Blade Runner reality will be like people overweight and not healthy, like sitting in front of like Luciferian screens and stuff. It's not going to be this kind of like, Harrison Ford assassin, Neo Tokyo kind of thing. It's the low vibrational realm of existence, because science fiction is based on ideas. It's not the body. It's not tragedy. It's conceptual ideas. It's as Mishima put it, it's more living within like the kind of the shadows of the mind, where like you're inside reading, and like that's an important thing, like gaining knowledge. But it's like what he was getting at was like lifting weights and being out in the sun was more of the embrace of tragedy itself, living with form. The sun gives life to things. The night, art is born in the night. Philosophy is born in the night of thought. But at the same time, there's a certain degeneracy that comes with that, where you're living in the world of formlessness versus like being out in the sun allows for muscles and form to have life. And that's therefore signaling their tragedy and their decay, is that they're not dying within the shadows where nothing is noticed. They're out in the open to decay to the world. I don't know if that made any sense. I'm kind of retarded, and I just kind of go on these like long tangents. I don't know if they make any sense.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to the retarded comment. So I think science fiction is like a really subversively beautiful name for it, because there's also the cheesy line of, we're going to make science fiction science fact, and every 10 years we have a different view of the future which never arrives, or it arrives in some budget way and we're disappointed by it. And this is the eschatology of scientism, basically, is that we're empirically discovering more and more facts. We're empirically making the world more rational. We're empirically making things more safe, less risk averse.
Yeah.
And it's got this weird eschatology that doesn't click with the reality of the universe, which isn't rational. It isn't within our scope as a rational and fallen beings to understand it like an omnipotent being, for example. So we're forever and ever until we escape this, like dogmatic myopia, which actually comes from metaphysics, in my opinion, that has this eschatological view that we're just 10 years from knowing everything, and there'll be no more tragedy, no more of anything. Not realizing that would be hell anyway if it were true, because there would be nothing. Though you'd be so bored. I think you'd be so bored if that were true.
That couldn't have said. You said perfectly summed up, man.
I think that's a pretty good bow then.
Boredom maybe being the opposite of tragedy.